Were the secondary tariffs which were imposed by Donald Trump on India unfair?
Do you expect increased trade negotiations, since you've announced the 50% tariff?
No, not until we get it resolved.
And is there a new world order emerging in the axis of Russia, China and India, and that camaraderie we saw at the SCO Summit in China? Hello and welcome to yet another episode on OneTake. We're going to talk international because what happens globally now also has a deep impact on India. We are talking at a time when the economics in our country is fastly moving, when there is a worry and apprehension in several quarters over here, including that of the government, that will the high tariff imposed by America have a deep impact on our economy. The international ratings like Fitch, S&P, Moody's, EY, all of them have predicted a more than 6.5 GDP growth rate. But India's own assessment as far as our own GDP figures estimations are putting it at more than 7.5%. But where is this hope and optimism and prediction coming from? It's coming in from this new world order which is emerging. And this despite what many say is very, very unfair, brutal and also a tad egoistic secondary tariff imposed by Donald Trump on India. Now let's talk about the first tariff very briefly. That was largely at 25%, and that is something which he is essentially imposing on every country because he wants to protect the American interests. But the second one, another 25%, was imposed to teach India a lesson. That is because he also wants to teach Russia a lesson, and Russia and America's difference of opinion, the fight, we know. Remember, for a long time, Donald Trump would blame Vladimir Putin for his defeat in the last elections in the United States of America. That anger, that angst was reflected in this 25% tariff imposed on India or the secondary tariff. That is because he has accused India, of all the countries in the world, of stoking the Russia-Ukraine war, of actually contributing to what he called Russian terrorism. It's laughable because in a country like India, which has suffered many times over acts of terrorism, where we reach out to other countries and support them unequivocally as far as terrorism is concerned, how can we ever support terrorism imposed by any other country? But more than that, the secondary tariff exposes the duplicity, the hypocrisy and the double standards of America. If you go by the figures, one of the largest importers of Russian uranium and energy or Russian gas is actually America. It funds, it stokes their energy needs. So shouldn't they also be accused of encouraging, in the words of Donald Trump, the war against Ukraine? But India has maintained an equidistant between Russia and Ukraine. If we speak to Putin, the Prime Minister also speaks to Zelensky. He shows his support both to Ukraine as well as to Russia. We've not chosen either or. We've never humiliated any head of state when they visited our headquarters like Donald Trump did with Zelensky. Today, he's shedding his tears for the war in Ukraine and Russia, completely forgetting how he made personal comments against Zelensky when he visited White House. But I'm not just talking about that. I'm talking about India's fighting back, how it's kicking the door. India is kicking the door by trying to build up an alternative world power. If today you saw that bonhomie between the Prime Minister and Vladimir Putin when they were traveling in the same car to the bilateral meeting, or you saw the smiles between the Prime Minister Putin and Xi of China, then there is a world order which India is trying to work upon and recreate. It's all about developing an access to take on Trump's unfair tariff. Look, every country has a right to protect their own economy, and I guess America is doing that. But witch hunt with someone who's been your all-weather friend, with whom you've actually shared good relationship, but more than that, because you want to teach someone a lesson who in your eyes is also supporting terrorism and war, that's very, very unfair. So India cannot be blamed if it's redrawing its strategy or its geopolitics strategy. That is, if it's now reaching out both to China and to Russia. Because India's calculation is India plus Russia plus China cannot just create a strategic defensive world order, but we can also create an economic order. We also know that one of the biggest exporters, importers has remained China. India's imports and exports to and from China remain sizable, almost in many segments overtaking that of our trade relationships with America. When America is shutting its doors to many of our imports to their country, because they've imposed a high tariff, it's our labor-intensive sector like footwear, like carpet, like textiles, all of it is being affected. But when India is going to open its doors to Russia and China also, this world order to protect our economy, to ensure that we grow, does make a lot of sense. Of course, there are many who are going to now start taking snide comments as us, but I'm going to talk about that a little bit later. I'm not just talking about domestic comments, but we're also talking about international comments. We are seeing how the Congress party, for example, has already accusing the Prime Minister of selling out. But the fact is that this is a choice that we have made. And on such issues, I guess the entire country needs to stand together. What is it that India aims to get with this new world order? Well, sources in the government tell me very confidently that we think that a mix of the Swadeshi, which means promoting our domestic brands, will create a demand for domestic manufacturing unit. Where we lose out to American markets, we are going to gain by a domestic market, and that's the reason why time and again the Prime Minister is talking about going domestic. For example, if we are going to promote khadi or handlooms, which were exported to a very great extent to, say, America, if we create a domestic demand where people are encouraged to buy handlooms and less of foreign big brands, then in a sense what happens is our manufacturing units will keep working round the clock, because they are worried what happens to their demand and supply. This is one big factor that we are aiming at, which is why we are also looking at markets in Russia and China. Chinese goods often flood the Indian markets because they work out to be cheaper. But the entire idea of an agreement with China and Russia to ensure that both the Chinese and our interests are also protected. Now, China also has a huge population, just as India has. They also understand the importance of labor-intensive industries. So they would understand our problem, we understand their problem, and that is why this world order becomes important. As far as buying Russian oil is concerned, well, we have every right to protect the interests of our own people, and Russian oil at that point of time certainly was emerging as a cheaper alternative. But guess what, who wanted us and encouraged us to buy Russian oil? It was very much America. So double standard once again stands exposed. So Swadeshi plus this axis of Russia, China, India is creating a new world order. Is this the right way to take on America? Is it possible for India to take on America? Look, it's not going to happen overnight. It's not going to happen in a month or in 15 days. It's a long-term project. India is looking at developing its own MSMEs, is looking at developing its own domestic industries, which is why this pitch for Swadeshi coming in from the Prime Minister. But on the other hand, reaching out to Russia and China. With China, we've not always had a very comfortable relationship. This question is being asked when China was definitely supporting Pakistan, providing arms to them, and China was creating trouble in our neighborhood, whether it's been Bangladesh, whether it is in Pakistan. Why then? And also now in Sri Lanka. Why now? That is precisely the reason. We need to take on China. Sometimes the way you take on is also by befriending them. That is exactly what we are doing. We are creating an alternative world order. We are seeking alternative markets. But most importantly, we in our own way are trying to teach a lesson to America that we can live without you also, or we can live beyond the secondary unfair tariff which has been imposed on us. In fact, Donald Trump perhaps has a reason to be worried. And the reason for his worry is that suddenly there seems to be large powers which are economic powers in their own way on one side and America on the other. How many people are friends with America at this point of time, and how many are going to start becoming friends with us? Because Russia with it will bring its own friends, China will bring their own friends, India of course has its own friends. Russia, China plus India could become a powerful economic and strategic superpower. So therefore I leave you with these questions. Like many may be wondering, like the opposition parties, are we doing the right thing? I personally think that I guess we are, because these are long drawn strategy, drawing room, drawing board, redrawing, which is very, very essential. And therefore, are we doing the right thing? Is aligning with Russia and China the right way to take on America? Is going Swadeshi being regressive, or going Swadeshi is actually helping build brand India, something which we often haven't? After all, don't forget the entire Prada controversy over the Kolhapuri. I guess that was a wake-up sign. That was a wake-up sign that what we should have valued ourselves was actually being usurped and valued by a bigger brand outside. Do give in your thoughts on the social media timeline, and thank you so much for watching once again.